Chapter 5 Adian. Field musicians are better than bards. Adian sat in a shadow-filled room full of grim faces surrounding a large rectangular table. What little light from the setting sun that made it into the room through a small window was barely enough to see by. Yet it was the only illumination, as no one had thought to bring a lamp or to start a fire in the council's hall's hearth. It should also be noted that the infected forest seems to have some control over the diseased creatures within. At least it does in regards to the rat gore. Or perhaps more realistically, whatever is causing the infection within the forest is also controlling the creatures that become infected. This means that Adian cut off and had to suppress a growl as he was once again interrupted. "Why do you think that the diseased creatures are being controlled?" A large man wearing a leather apron asked in a gruff voice, as he scratched his head with an ash-smudged hand. "Blacksmith Weston, I presume?" Adian questioned, and he continued once he got an affirmative nod. "I have twice been chased by a group of rat gore to the limits of the boundaries of the infection, at which point they stop, never allowing a whisker to cross the disease boundary, and eventually turn around. Their movements are synchronized and more closely resemble an army led by a general than a group of wild animals. One particular example of this is while I was attempting to follow two of them back to their nest, they led me on a merry chase instead. It wasn't until I was distracted that they actually returned to their nest, which either shows a level of intelligence greater than any rat gore I have ever encountered, or means that they are being controlled. Besides that, within moments of me finding the rat gore nest, I was attacked by a large infected cat, which could be a coincidence, I suppose, but looking back at the situation, it seems more likely that whatever is controlling the infection wanted to keep itself secret, so it tried to kill me. However, once I left its territory, it knew that its anonymity was compromised, so it sent its rat gore to attack the farmers." Silence reigned around the table, as Neridne's town council worked through the implications of Adian's words. It stretched past the point of discomfort before healer Noralee spoke up. "Your conclusions are filled with assumptions," she said to him as others sat in silence. She looked weary from her ministrations to the injured couple, and the bloodstains on her once pure white dress made it obvious that she hadn't had a chance to properly clean herself. "However, from what you've told us, it does seem that they are at least founded in logic. I assume that you are under the impression that the rat gore nest is actually a newly developed dungeon?" "Yes. A dungeon seems to be the only explanation that fits, unless anyone else can think of another entity that could control creatures in such a way within an altered domain?" Adian asked, as he suppressed any reaction at his surprise that the healer was the first one to reach the same conclusion he had. "A necromancer, perhaps?" A well-groomed man with short-cropped dark hair and beard, both speckled with gray, asked in a deep baritone. He wore a sharp suit, and Adian recognized him to be Dre's father. "Could the creatures you encountered in the diseased domain be some kind of undead?" "That is a possibility, but the creatures seemed more sick than undead to me. Obviously, the line between those two can become quite blurry at the extremes. Besides, a necromancer would be a much graver threat than an early-stage dungeon. Have there been any mysterious disappearances lately? It is likely that someone in this village or the surrounding area has become dungeon-bound." This question was met with only silence, and yet the council still answered him. Adian watched their eyes as they all surreptitiously glanced at a lean man with wood shavings stuck to his durable clothes. For his part, the lumberjack just stared at the ground. The silence grew and grew until its weight, combined with the council members' gazes, became unbearable. He spoke softly, in the hesitant tone of someone trying to convince themselves of their own words. "My son Dexter has been missing for a few weeks now, but this wouldn't be the first time. He often goes off on little misadventures. He may be odd sometimes, but there's no way he would choose the life of a dungeon-bound." His statement was followed by more silence. Adian wanted to ask follow-up questions, but the desperate worry in the lumberjack's eyes caused him to hesitate. Before he could find the words to say, a plump man wearing an ostentatious purple outfit and sitting at the head of the table spoke in a surprisingly shrill voice. "Thank you, Bard Adian, for bringing us this information. Neridne owes you a debt. However, unless anyone has more questions..." He glanced disapprovingly around the room in an obvious attempt to silence any inquisitive council members. "It would appear not, and so it would seem that your assistance has reached its limits." The man's words were quite civil, but his countenance left much to be desired. "Oh," Adian said, annoyed as much by the improper class title as by the mayor's dismissal. Are you sure that I can't be of any more help, Lord Kai? I think that I have more information that could be— Oh, I am quite sure. Now leave, Lord Kai said, the last word hitting Adian with an almost tangible compulsion. Adian stood firm, resisting the command for longer than he should have been able to, as he ruminated on how much he hated leaders who used compulsion-based command skills. After proving to Lord Kai that his skill didn't have power over him, Adian replied with as much tact as he could muster. Well, okay then. I am currently staying at the Fox's Lair. If you need any more information, or anything else for that matter, please feel free to send for me. Yes, the Lord nodded, a condescending sneer wrinkling his pudgy face. If we want to hear a tavern ditty, we'll be sure to stop by. As Adian left the council room, he would have sworn that storm clouds were gathering above his brow. If we want to hear a tavern ditty, we'll be sure to stop by, he mocked in a low voice. How could Lord Kai still see him as a performer when he had just brought them such important information? Was it not obvious that he was capable? Was it not obvious that he would be invaluable to the rest of the conversation? That he had ideas and experiences that none of the civilian council members had? Lord Kai wouldn't dare talk to him like that if he had any idea who— But no. Adian had promised himself years ago to stop thinking such thoughts. So he moved to the edge of the street in front of a windowed shop with a cart in front of it. He stopped, closed his eyes, and focused on his breathing for a few long moments. His breath started out quick and agitated, but each time he breathed more deeply, and for a more extended period of time until his breaths were deep and regular. Adian wasn't sure how he felt about many of the life lessons that his father had taught him, but one that he had taken to heart was that the body could be used to control the mind. A chaotic mind could rarely be subdued into order by mere thoughts. Physical actions, like exercise, training, or even focused breathing, were much more effective in his experience. As his breathing deepened, his thoughts began to clear. His anger was perhaps justified at the village head, but was it useful? Did it make any sense for him to act out on it? Probably not. It was wrong for that man to assume he had little to bring to the discussion. It was wrong of him to imply that Adian's greatest value would be brought by entertaining the drunken cowards of a tavern's common room. But wasn't this response to be expected? Hadn't he received this response countless times? When people heard his class, they immediately assumed that he was just a small-time performer at best, some kind of bard. Adian let out a disgusted sound at the thought and shook his head. He breathed deeply a couple more times to once again bring his thoughts into order. People were always going to underestimate him because of his class, but that was okay. He knew well that people were more than their class, and he was confident that he would gain respect from the people that truly mattered when they saw him in action. He had gained the respect in the ranks of the caravan guard he had joined after leaving his home. He had gained respect in the Raven militia, and he would come to gain respect here, and within the adventuring community at large. Getting angry at people for misunderstanding a class they knew nothing about was a useless endeavor, even if it was justifiable, even if the people judging were useless piles of— Hey, Adian, is everything okay? A deep and familiar voice startled him out of his thoughts. Adian looked up to see Dre standing there, towering over him physically but still somehow managing to seem submissive. I'm fine, just trying to get my thoughts in order. How are you holding up? I'm doing all right. Hungry, though. I'm meeting up with a friend for dinner at the Fox's Lair. He hesitated and glanced nervously between the ground and Adian's face a few times before he asked, Would you like to join us? Adian grinned at the young man's nervousness. Yeah, that sounds nice. I was actually just on my way there now. I'm famished. Dre nodded, and they began to walk towards the inn. Was there trouble with the council? Not really. They got together to hear my news quite quickly and seemed to take what I said seriously, but Lord Kai didn't think it was necessary for me to stick around to discuss solutions. I think that once he heard my class, he kind of wrote me off. Even after they heard what you did for farm wife Gladys and her husband? What you did for me? I told them about the farmer and his wife, obviously, but I didn't mention your misadventure. I didn't want to put you under their scrutiny. Adian gave Dre a conspiratorial wink before continuing. But yes, they seemed appreciative enough of my actions. You know how it is, though, don't you? Class is everything. It's true in my home kingdom of Jezwahe, just as much as it's true here in the kingdom of Astiverin. It's true in a small town like this as surely as it is in Davidorit or even in Telpaic. Dre hesitated, and his face turned a little pale. If you don't mind me asking, What is your class? It's called Field Musician. Adian looked at Dre hopefully, but as expected, there was no light of recognition in his eyes, so Adian elaborated. It's essentially a musician class designed for warfare and fighting. Dre's eyes widened and his face lit up. That sounds awesome, but I don't think I've ever heard of it. Not many have, and even less are impressed by it, so thanks for that, Adian smiled. It's a rare class, but it is well known in military circles. Honestly, the most common response I get to my class is laughter. People see it as being a combination of two things that are totally opposite and can't possibly fit together. Music and battle just don't mix in some people's minds. I guess I can understand the reaction. People always look at me weird when I tell them I want to be an icy fire mage or a holy assassin. Dre smiled and let out a small, not quite giggle at his own joke. And Adian couldn't help but join in with a snort and laugh of his own. When he caught his breath, Dre continued. But seriously, I think it sounds cool. From what little I have seen, it seems quite useful as well. I mean, you directly saved 3 people's lives today. And who knows how many lives will be helped since you were able to give warning. If that doesn't speak of your class's value, then I'm not sure what would. True. I guess some people have a hard time getting past their initial opinions regardless of the evidence piled in front of them. Dre paused for a moment before he asked, What is the difference between your class and a bard? Adian felt his expression sour, and Dre must have noticed as well because he hurried to say, Sorry if that's a stupid question. They just seem kind of similar. Aren't bards musicians that are meant for battle as well? Adian sighed before a torrent of words spilled out of his mouth. Everyone seems to think so, but not really. I am nothing like any of the bards that I have met. Everything they are known for is completely different than what I strive to be. Bards are a musician class that excel at entertaining and certain aspects of adventuring, but not battle in particular, at least not generally. Adventuring teams that include a bard do so in spite of the fact that they are more often than not a liability in battle. Adian paused to take a deep breath and then continued speaking at a more subdued pace. Sure, they might have a couple of skills useful in battles, and they play an instrument, so of course I understand the surface-level similarities. But both duelists and knights use swords, and no one seems to get those classes confused. I mean, think about it. Bard skills are usually based around charisma, smooth talking, keeping up morale, spying, writing famous songs, even making love. Adian paused to stifle a smile in response to the sudden red flush in Dre's cheeks. I have some skills for keeping up morale, but most of my other skills are directly related to battle or recovery. It's the reason that I chose field musician instead of bard in the first place. You had the option for bard and chose field musician? I thought that you wanted to become an adventurer and not a soldier. Adian laughed bitterly. Bard wasn't the most impressive or surprising class I passed up on, but yes, I did. Just because bards are more common in adventuring teams doesn't make them better. I was born with the ability to write songs, and I've never wanted more charm than I already have. As a musician, the one thing that was really holding me back from being an adventurer was the ability to fight. So I chose the class to best fill that weakness. Although, I do have to admit that my skills definitely aren't ideal for adventuring at times, especially solo adventuring. I think being part of a larger group will be the sweet spot for me. Dre nodded along. That makes sense. But do you want to continue this conversation over some food? He pointed behind Adian. Adian turned and stared in surprise at the wooden door with the image of a fox etched into it. How long had they been standing there? He was even more exhausted than he thought if his powers of observation had plummeted so precipitously. He nodded and then followed the younger man into the fox's lair. Mugs pounded the tables, forks clanked against clay dishes, loud laughter and quiet conversation all melded together into an orchestral accompaniment of the song being sung by a young woman standing in a corner of the large tavern room. She appeared to be similar to Dre's age, and had long, flowing blonde hair that cascaded down her shoulders to the middle of her back. Her face was an example of perfect symmetry, and her body a testament of perfect health. But her voice was mediocre at best. Adian gave a small sigh and looked around the rest of the room. He'd only been staying in this particular inn for a couple of nights, but after the day he had just experienced, entering the common room felt like coming home. This pleasant illusion was shattered immediately as a rotund woman with perpetually flushed cheeks made her way towards him with a purpose. Adian closed his eyes and let out another sigh. When he opened them, he put on a tired smile and said, Hello, innkeeper Sarosa. How are you doing this evening? I have already told you, Bard. Call me innkeeper or call me Sarosa. Together it is far too long and I simply don't have the time for it. If you want to make my evening better, then you could keep your promise from this morning and play some music. with the uproar caused by the injuries to poor Gladys and that brute farmer whom she, for reasons beyond me, still calls husband. Sorosa rolled her eyes aggressively before continuing. People want to talk, and when people want to talk, they come here. We have been swamped for a couple hours already, and poor Mindy has been singing the whole time. I think her voice is about to give, said the innkeeper in a rush of shrill words. Adian stared blankly at the pushy woman. And I have already told you I am a field musician, not a bard. Anyways, I really would love to help you out, but I have had quite the day. I actually was the one that saved. I'm sure that you've been busy too, but I'll tell you what. If you play for an hour or two, I'll consider your food tonight and tonight's stay paid for. Adian frowned at her. He took a deep breath and had to restrain himself from letting out a sigh. Instead, he breathed out slowly and said, All right, Sorosa, but only after I eat some food. I'm far too famished to play as I am. All right. I'll have one of the girls bring you our best immediately. She held out her hand and a few coins appeared out of thin air. Here's your refund. Try to be quick with your supper, she said before she bustled into the kitchen and yelled something indiscernible to her staff. Adian shook his head and turned back to look at Dre, but the tall boy wasn't there. He only had to search for a moment, though, before he caught sight of him gesturing towards a small table where he was seated alongside a pretty young brunette woman. Adian walked over and introduced himself to her before he sat down. She, in turn, gave him a small, and Adian wasn't sure about this, but perhaps a slightly strained smile. She introduced herself as Asya, but as she did, she glanced at Dre, who was watching the young lady singing in the corner. So, are you two... Adian started to question, but was interrupted by a mug of mead splashing down on the table in front of him, along with a plate of beans and chicken. He immediately lost track of what he had been about to ask and dug into his food voraciously. He paid very little heed to Dre and Asya as they chatted amiably while waiting for their own meals. Far too soon, his plate was clean and mug dry, at which point he actually started paying attention to the conversation the two young people were having. I know. I'll wake you up when your breathing settles into a deep sleep, Asya said to Dre reassuringly. We have been planning this for years. Adian smiled, thinking about his class day, and said, Late night, post-class choice discussion, huh? I remember doing that with my brothers. I take it that you two aren't related, though? Asya immediately responded with a vehement shake of her head, but Dre responded with a smile. We might as well be. Asya and I have been much closer than Javid and I ever were. In response to this, Asya took a deep breath, lowered her head to her hand, and rubbed her temple, all of which seemed to go unnoticed by Dre, who was looking around the room as if he was trying to find something. Adian couldn't stop himself from smiling as he looked back and forth between the pair with a single raised brow. Asya noticed his expression quickly, and her face reddened before she looked down at her lap, which made Adian instantaneously feel like a total jerk. In an effort to shift the conversation in a less awkward direction, Adian asked, Is Javan your brother? Yes. He isn't in Neridni anymore, though. He left about a year ago to apprentice under an herbalist in Raven. Haven't seen him since, Jay responded, the last words carrying some obvious spite. Oh, I was in Raven for a couple of years. Just left a few months ago. I knew the herbalist a little, and now that you mention it, I think I might have seen your brother. I remember that the herbalist had a young man with him for a while. He must have started sending him into the woods to gather herbs all day, though. I only remember seeing him around for a couple of months. Dre shrugged. Yeah, or he was just hiding in the woods of his own accord. Javan has always been more comfortable in nature than with people. Adian caught sight of Sorosa staring at him and his empty plate, so he excused himself from the table and ran up to his room. He grabbed his guitar from the pile of instruments he had carried up after returning to town and promised himself not to take his cart full of instruments around with him anymore. The extra potency that his different instruments had in certain situations just wasn't worth the inconvenience of dragging them around, as was perfectly demonstrated with his day of adventuring. He had lugged around all those instruments, but only ever used his violin. He shook his head at his own foolishness as he returned to the common room. He told the young singer Mindy that she could take a break, and then sat down on a small stool that he pulled over from under a nearby table. Then, without any introduction, he began to pluck the strings of his Sitka spruce-bodied guitar. He played just loudly enough to be noticed over the noise of the crowd, but not loud enough to be heard well. People slowly started to quiet down as the people who noticed him shushed others. Once the roar of the tavern had been reduced to a low mumble, he activated influential music and began to play an eerie, yet enchanting, melody. There once was a girl who lived by the sea. She was friends with a boy who lived in a tree. They laughed and they played, always disobeyed. There once was a boy who lived in a tree. He was friends with the girl who lived by the sea. Together they grew, to each other stayed true. Now the parents of the girl who lived by the sea weren't fond of the boy who lived in the tree. He wasn't well bred, or even well read. And the parents of the boy who lived in the tree weren't fond of the girl who lived by the sea. She wasn't that strong. She wouldn't be long. The girl by the sea had rules to follow, but the boy in the tree wouldn't go with the flow. He wanted her time. Was it really a crime? The boy in the tree was forbid from a trip, but the girl by the sea snuck him on the ship. She wanted his grin. Was it really a sin? So the girl by the sea was sent far away. The boy in the tree, he was forced to stay. She tried to write, but he tried to fight. The boy in the tree, he died by the sea, and the girl by the sea, she cried in a tree. Adian looked out with simple pleasure at the deathly still common room as the last word rang out, and the guitar's notes slowly faded. The song had many more verses, but Adian stopped it there. It was well known throughout his home country of Jeswahay, but he had learned quickly upon crossing the border that it was ubiquitous throughout all of Astiverin. He liked to use the hauntingly familiar tune to draw crowds in, but he found that if he continued the tragic lyrics any further, the mood would be brought too low. The room stayed silent until someone coughed wetly, and then, as if a spell had been broken, the tavern roared back to life with applause. Adian treated the crowd to a genuine smile, and then began to play a lively country favorite.